Hello, and welcome to Explore Within Coaching. I'm Oceana. Today, I want to talk to you about a subject matter that is very near and dear to my heart, as well as give a trigger warning. This is going to touch on sexual trauma and healing sexual trauma, and I'm also going to be discussing BDSM and using BDSM techniques in order to help heal sexual trauma. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So a little bit about my story. I was sexually molested at quite a young age, and it went on for quite a while. I also had a uncle who tried to sexually molest me. He was interrupted, thankfully, and I was raped as a teenager, and then as a young adult, in an expression of empowerment, I then gave away sex very freely. So I had a lot of sexual trauma that I needed to start healing in order to become a stronger, more empowered woman that I am today. So, a little bit about BDSM. My first introduction to BDSM was in my very, very early 20s, like 19, 20 years old. I went to a fetish show and I saw things there that I was like, hell to the no, that is never going to happen. And then in about my mid 20s, I met a person who was into BDSM, and there was a moment. He was making a spanking bench, and I asked what that was. It just didn't even occur to me what it might be. Silly me. And so he showed me. And as part of that demonstration, he slapped my ass once. And that was very confusing for me because instantly I felt sexual excitement, but somebody had hit me. And that was an absolute no. So there was that confusion that was happening within me. And so I made it very clear that that was never going to happen, that I would never allow for a man to hit me, that is not love, that is not sexy, and hell to the no. What I didn't understand is that I was already engaging in BDSM type things. Now, for anybody who doesn't know what BDSM is, it is bondage discipline, sadism, masochism. There's an energy play that happens. There's lots of things that make up BDSM. And this video isn't about what BDSM is, it's about how I used it to help with my own sexual healing. So back in 2014, 2015, I started getting involved in the BDSM community. And I started this by going to classes where they were teaching people about all the sexy things. And my first class that I went to was a class on just introduction to BDSM. And it was an interesting class. There was some great information in there. But one of the things they talked about was consent. And I didn't like their consent talk, actually. I thought that it was not enough. And that led me to start looking into what consent was. And there is a great acronym for consent, and it's called FRIES. So consent is freely given. It is revocable 100% of the time. It is informed. So you're making your decisions based on information, not on ifs and ands, and it is 100% information. It is enthusiastic. And if it is not an enthusiastic yes, then it is a hell no. And lastly, it's specific. And from this FRIES, this consent base, I started realizing that I needed to start consenting in my own sexual life. And that oftentimes I was engaging in sexual activities where I wasn't informed, where it wasn't really an enthusiastic yes. I got myself into situations where I felt like I couldn't say no. I couldn't take back the consent that I was giving. I had not gotten myself into a place where it wasn't freely given, just that I didn't feel it was revocable. And from there, I went, okay, like something needs to shift, something needs to change. So I went to another class, and in this class, it was all about communicating. And this was a big hell yes for me. As somebody who had been coaching for a while, I understood that communication was the key. What I didn't understand was that my lack of communication in my sexual acts was actually causing more trauma. And so I started communicating. I started communicating before sex. I started communicating during sex, and I communicate after sex. And it may not be like right after sex. I might wait until the next day and go, hey, like this really worked well for me. This really didn't work well for me. If we do this again, let's leave out this part and let's do more of this part. And that helped. The other thing that became important with communicating was communicating what was actually happening, the truth of what was happening within me. And it meant being brutally honest with my partners about things that I knew were triggers, about things that I knew were shameful in my own body, areas that I didn't like touched or I didn't like admired. And for my partner to understand what my body shame was, for my partner to understand what my yeses were and my nos were, allowed for us to have a healthier sex life. It allowed for us to have more fun, more juiciness. The next thing I learned was about negotiation. Now, negotiation is incredibly important. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't care how long you've been in a relationship for, negotiation should be a part of every time you decide to engage in sex. Now, what is that? Negotiating is sitting down with your partner and saying, these are the things that I am good with. These are the things I am not okay with. What are you good with? What are you not okay with? And getting really clear and almost making a list. And by having this list, you suddenly have all this playground to play in. And it's a free playground because you guys have already talked about it. You've already determined that these are things that are okay to happen. Now, that doesn't mean that in the moment that it's going to be okay. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, it's about communicating honestly and then negotiating a list of all the fun things you guys get to do. And it's also having a clear list of what is not okay to do. So that both people know going into this, that in this being the actual playing and the actual having sex, both people know what are going to be acceptable and what is going to be unacceptable. And it takes so much pressure off. It takes away all the questions of, well, if I do this, are they going to be okay with that? If I do that, are they going to enjoy that? Because you already know whether or not it's on the list or off the list. And if it comes up and it is not on the list of a yes, then it is an absolute no. I want to say that again. If something comes up in the middle of sex that is not on the list, it is an absolute no. Now, you can put it on the list for later, but just not for that moment. The next thing that I learned about were the safe words, and this was fucking empowering. This was the absolute key for me working through some of my sex triggers. And so I'm just going to use the basic safe words. People that engage in BDSM, sometimes have their own safe words, but there's universal safe words that everybody knows. And it follows the traffic lights. Red, yellow, green. Red is an absolute stop. Yellow is a proceed with caution, something's going on. And a green is a hell yes, let's go, go, go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a trigger for me. When I was hiking through a park in the city I lived in, I had a gentleman on a bike who approached me, got off his bike, and threw me to the ground, wrapped his hands around my throat. Now, I was really lucky in that moment because somebody else came along and they put a stop and they scared him off. But I know that had that person not come along, I would not have survived that I just would not have survived. The man who straddled me with his hands around my throat had no intentions of leaving me alive. And from that time forward, I actually couldn't wear anything on my throat. This necklace sitting here this would have been too tight for me. Everything had to be quite low. I would wear only chains that were like 24 inches long. I wore necklines that were down. I couldn't wear a turtleneck. I couldn't even bring my own hand up to my throat without going into panic, without going into this trauma space. And I remember the first time I was walking around a play party and I was watching this beautiful knife scene. Oh my God, it was so beautiful. There was so much love and so much attention that was being shared between the top and the bottom. And watching the blade trace over the body was erotically beautiful. Until the moment that blade came up to the throat. And this was not even my throat. And I went into panic. I went into trauma and I had to leave the room. At that moment, I knew that I could no longer allow for this trigger to affect me. And so I needed to start finding ways to deal with my throat trigger. I found an amazing, loving partner, and through communication, I was able to share with him the trauma that had happened and the way that it was actually affecting me today. And he very lovingly helped me work through this trauma. And we used the safe words. We used red, we used yellow, we used green, and we used the communication, the good negotiation, and the safe words regularly. Like every single time we got together and we were going to engage in sex, we communicated, we negotiated, and then we communicated during sex and we communicated after sex, and we talked about what worked for us and what didn't work for us. And this went on for like 3-4 years. Yeah, you heard me right. 3 or 4 years. We communicated every single time we engaged sexually. And we did that so that I could heal, so that I could be safe, so that I could come to a space where I truly enjoyed sex. Not that I was being sexually active and yeah, it was good and it was fun, but where I could actually enjoy sex. Where the idea of being penetrated was now about me, not about another. The idea of being naked and having my body explored brought me no shame. The ideas that I deserved the pleasure, that I was worth more than just my sexual body, and that it wasn't just something to be used and abused. I was able to heal using BDSM. And the learnings and the teachings that BDSM is about. Now, I know that there are a lot of people that feel that BDSM is abuse. Hell, I was one of those people. Remember at the beginning, I talked about the fact that I was shocked that I was okay, that somebody had, not that I was okay, that I got pleasure out of somebody who had spanked my ass. And that was a very confusing thought, because violence and sex don't go together, or they shouldn't go together. That was the way that I felt. But what I learned is that my body actually enjoys a certain amount of pain, and it brings me pleasure. And it not that I want somebody to walk up and slap me in the face. In fact, that is a hard no. That is on my list of absolutely nevers, because that is still abuse to me. There is nothing sexy to me about somebody slapping my face or spitting on me or humiliating me or degrading me. Those are hard no's. And I understand there are people that get pleasure from it, that actually take empowerment from it, because they were in that situation where those things happened to them and they were disempowered. And by negotiating and through communication, they were able to allow for those actions to happen, and now are empowered with it. And that's really important, because what works for me may not work for another, and what works for another may not work for me. And that is okay, because it's ultimately about our healing and our pleasure. So if you are somebody who has been sexually traumatized and who is struggling to enjoy sex, and I mean really fucking enjoy it, to yearn for the deep penetration, to yearn for the connection that happens with it, to not have to disconnect yourself from your sexual body in order to enjoy, then I highly recommend you take on some of the learnings of BDSM. And I'm not talking the physical sex acts. I'm talking the consent, the communication, the negotiation, the safe words. And I want to leave you with one other thing that was really important for me in my healing, and that was the aftercare. Aftercare is something that I can now do for myself. I sometimes enjoy it better if my partner does it for me. I've discovered I'm quite the greedy little girl sometimes, and I'm really good with that, just so we're clear. I remember I watched a scene. This was just after I came into the BDSM community and had started paying attention. And I had watched this couple who had played quite hard, harder than I would have been okay with. And afterwards, I watched him grab a fuzzy blanket, wrap it around her, grab her some water and some chocolate, and he just sat on the floor with her, wrapped his arms around her, and, whispered in her ear, I don't even know what, but I know that she would drink from her water, that he would give her a little bit of chocolate. And he sat with her until she was in a space that she was good to get up and walk away. And I thought it was the most beautiful, loving act of compassion I'd ever seen. To take somebody and to truly care for them until they were okay to get up and walk away on their own was the most beautiful thing. Now, sometimes I need for my partner to do that. I need for my partner to hold me and to just make my world centered again. But I've also learned that I can grab my own blanket, and I can grab my own water, and I can rock myself and self-soothe, thank you, to make myself feel better. And I will do this if I get triggered, even in my everyday. I attended a course in November, and we were doing this dance, and through this dance it was building pleasure, building, and I hit overwhelm. And I was by myself in a room, and when I hit that overwhelm, I just about lost it. So I decided to self-soothe. I decided to do my own self-care. And so I grabbed a fuzzy blanket and I wrapped it around me. I grabbed my water and I just rocked. And I rocked and I rocked and I rocked and I rocked until I started to calm down. And as I started to calm down and the tears were flowing, and I just allowed the emotion to be, and then I was fine and I was good to carry on. So yeah, I highly recommend, if you are somebody who has been sexually traumatized and struggling with sex and struggling with finding pleasure in your sex. I mean, sex should be about pleasure. It shouldn't be about trauma. And if you've been traumatized by sex, it's time to take back your power. It's time to start being empowered in your own sex. And this can be done with the learnings of BDSM. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not suggesting that everybody needs to get involved in BDSM in order to heal sex trauma, okay? Like, I just want to be very, very clear. However, I do believe that, again, consent that is freely given, 100% revocable, it is informed, it is enthusiastic, and it is specific, is a great step to starting to heal trauma. I then recommend getting into communicating with your partner and communicating honestly. Communicate about what are yeses for you, what are no's for you, where do you hold body shame, where do you hold a trigger. Our bodies all have it. That one place or two places or 10 places where we can't be touched for one reason or another. Be open about those places and talk about why, so that your partner understands. Talk about start negotiating a scene. And I want to share this. I had a partner once, just after I started negotiating, who went, oh, you know what? Like, I find that doing this negotiation thing, it takes away from the pleasure and the spontaneity of what we're going to do. And I allowed for it. Now, what he didn't find sexy is when he went up for my throat and I slugged him. Because I reacted. There was nothing sexy about my reaction to his caress. And it was after that he realized we actually needed to negotiate, because that was a hard no. That even lightly touching my throat was a hard no. So if somebody tells you that it's not sexy to negotiate, remind them that it's not sexy for you to go into trauma and for all sex to stop either. And if they're still not willing to negotiate, hun, say goodbye. If your partner is not willing to communicate with you, is not willing to negotiate with you, and is not willing to follow the consent fries, get rid of them, because you are still being traumatized. That's a whole other video, and I actually need to wrap this up. So, take care. Stay safe out there. Be good to one another, and love yourself a little bit more each day, every day.